first questions that our customers ask us when they're considering JDA as a cloud service provider is, how are you going to protect our data? Now, there's a lot of legislation in the European Union, and the perception is that this is very complicated and it's a risk area for customers. I'd like to dispel those myths. So this shouldn't be a barrier to JDA customers looking at JDA as a cloud service provider and being able to capitalise on the cost savings and speed at which they can ramp up those cloud services. So what does JDA do? Well, we do a lot of things. Firstly, we take this very seriously, as would any organisation that has got to comply with data protection legislation. The sort of things we do are we talk to one another. So I work very closely with our head of security. We make sure that we have policies in place that specify how we comply with the legislation. And behind those policies, we have practices that reflect the things that we need to do as an organisation. From a security perspective, that would involve technical security, password, segregation of roles, adequate site security, those kind of things. Well, there's been a lot of press speculation lately about US government surveillance of data. The Patriot Act is something that customers raise during negotiations as a concern. Now, do I really think this is something that a customer should be concerned about? Not really, for the following reasons. The Patriot Act is a piece of legislation that's been around for quite a long time now, and it was brought about to consolidate some fairly old legislation. And this can happen when you have some new legislation. Quite often it's not always that new. Now, are these powers that the government has to perform surveillance activity to fight against terrorism going to be used to access a retail or manufacturing customer's data hosted on JDA Cloud? I don't think so. One of the first points I should make is that this legislation doesn't apply to allow a US government to access commercial information. Secondly, it's not an absolute right. There are defences to these sort of applications or subpoenas that can be levied. So this is not an area that I perceive to be a high-risk area. And at the end of the day, if a US government's going to want to perform surveillance, they could do that whether it were a JDA-hosted cloud service or a customer-hosted cloud service. So the reason why the Patriot Act shouldn't be a concern is that other governments, so non-US governments, have similar powers, and they also have reciprocal arrangements within Europe to facilitate the investigation of criminal activity, for example, terrorism. Now, when MPs of local government make statements that European companies shouldn't host their data centres offshore, i.e. in the US, because of the concern of US surveillance, I don't think these comments are particularly helpful. They beg the question why, particularly when, as I've just said, local governments have their own investigatory powers under local legislation. One of the other points that I would like to talk about, there's been a lot of press speculation about Snowden. Now, whilst it's been very interesting to read, I do think it has created a greater sense of concern, a nervousness about data security. Snowden was a US government employee. He took it upon himself, based upon his a moral obligation in his mind, to take information that he received as part of his employment and disseminate it into the public domain to make the public aware of US government's practices. Now, that of itself is a concern. And I don't think, again, as I've said earlier, the US government is particularly interested in retail and manufacturing data. However, what I do think Snowden is illustrative of is where the real risk lies, and that's in the individual. And this is a risk that we all face and we can't avoid. But there are policies and practices that we can all put in place that JDA does on a regular basis. I perform annual reviews, I perform ad hoc checks of our practices within our organisation to make sure that we're complying with the European data protection legislation.